Welcome, everyone, to the Revolutionary Man podcast. We're here to challenge men to redefine success, lead with integrity, and create a lasting impact. I'm your host, Alan DeMonso, and today we're going to tackle the more relentless enemy that every man faces, and that's his inner critic. So there's that voice in your head, the one that tells you that you're not good enough, that you'll fail, that you don't deserve success. It's just noise. And it's carefully and craftily narrated to shape our past failures, societal expectations, and our deepest fears. But if we leave this unchecked, it sabotages our confidence, it stunts our growth, and it keeps us playing small. But here's the truth. We're not meant to live under the weight of our self-doubt. We're meant to designed to lead, to grow, and to firm up who we are as men. And today, I'm going to show you how to master your inner critic so it becomes your greatest ally, not your worst enemy. And so if you're ready to take back control and build unshakable confidence, I think this episode is going to be for you. Before we dive in, I need you to take some action. If this episode resonates with you, then I want you to hit that like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the biggest lie your inner critic has ever told you. And when men like you engage, it helps us spread this message and empowers others and even more men to silence the self-doubt that they're facing and to step into their greatness. So let's make this conversation bigger. Let's subscribe and let's keep moving forward. And with that, let's get on with today's episode.
The average man today is sleepwalking through life, many never reaching their true potential, let alone ever crossing the finish line to living a purposeful life. Yet, the hunger still exists, albeit buried amidst his cluttered mind, misguided beliefs, and values that no longer serve him. It's time to align yourself for greatness. It's time to become a revolutionary man. Stay strong, my brother.
Let me ask you a couple of questions. How often does the voice in your head criticize you instead of supporting you? And what would your life look like if that inner critic voice became your greatest ally instead of your worst enemy? These are going to be hard questions, but they need to be asked. And now let's unpack the truth about the inner critic and master it once and for all. We've set this stage. It's a stage that has some pretty high stakes, and we've asked ourselves some fairly tough questions, haven't we? And now it's time we're going to really dig into the strategies that silence that inner critic and unlock our confidence. The first thing I want to discuss is, what is this inner critic? This inner critic is that internal voice of self-doubt, self-judgment that's constantly questioning not just our abilities, but our decisions, and sometimes even our self-worth. It often stems from our childhood conditioning. When we think about how we've been raised and the lessons and the stories we've brought forward from that. It also comes from our societal expectations and what we've started to internalize as being an expectation for ourselves. And of course, it also comes from those personal failures and how we're putting the framework around what those failures are to mean. But if you're like most men, we may start to believe this voice is a reflection of reality, but the truth is that it's just a construct. It's an accumulation of negative experiences that we have yet to reshape, and they stay stuck in our brain, replaying this unwinding, never-ending loop and tape. And it's there to protect us because our ego perceives that there's failure about to happen. And so if we leave this inner critic unchecked, this voice becomes not just self-sabotaging, but it also is a way of coping for whenever we get into stressful situations. And so it convinces us that, hey, you know what, Al? It's time to play small, to hesitate, to avoid taking risks that could lead us to growth. And so that's why sometimes our careers stagnate, our marriages struggle, and our personal lives don't become totally evolved in the men that we wish to be. So why does this even exist? From an evolutionary perspective, this inner critic was developed as a survival mechanism, as many of the things that we face today. It's a warning us against that there's a potential risk that might endanger us, but we're no longer afraid of saber-toothed tigers, are we? That saber-toothed tiger today is standing up for what you believe in. And so it's an opportunity for us to learn, to change, and to grow. And so these are learned behaviors. And with every criticism from an authority figure, especially, like whether that's a parent or a teacher or maybe even a mentor, can even come from our peers. It can shape how we talk to ourselves as adults. So it's really important that we understand how this inner critic has evolved. And then there's the idea from the ego that this is this perceived idea of how it's protecting us. It's that inner critic believes that if we protect ourselves, if I protect you, my ego, if I protect you from harm and rejection, then I know that you're going to be safe. And so that comes up and it really shows up in different aspects of our life, right? It starts to erode our confidence. So we repeatedly start to have these bouts of negative self-talk. And so it diminishes our belief in our capabilities. I'm not sitting here saying that inner critic exists in all aspects of life, but there's probably an area in your life where it's a little stronger of a voice than in others. And so what ends up by happening is we get analysis of paralysis. And so we choose not to move forward because this inner critic is preventing us from taking those risks. It's like pursuing this new career, or when I get started doing men's work and doing a podcast, will this be good enough? And ultimately, it's about taking a risk and leaning into it. And if we truly leave this thing unchecked, it will strain our relationships because it harms who we are. We become less confident as men. And let's face it, gentlemen, if you're less confident, you're not very attractive. And that's part of the challenge that we will face, especially if we face lots of rejection in our life. And so, what's the science behind this inner critic concept and idea? Neuroscientists suggest that the negative self-talk is linked to these neural pathways in our brains that reinforce patterns of fear and self-doubt. And we've been talking about that for a little bit now. But the more that we engage this inner critic, and the stronger and more automatic these thoughts and patterns are going to become. And so as we just allow these to happen, if we're not doing something different, something to approach and attack this, then it's going to really be debilitating. And so the amygdala in our brain here is that brain's fear center, and it activates when we experience self-doubt. And so it can be firing and wiring on many occasions. And so because it treats it like it's a real threat, it doesn't understand whether that's a real or perceived threat. And so it triggers the stress response, and you'll start to notice that and feel that in your body, maybe in the pace of your communication and in different aspects. But we're going to touch on that in a little bit. So the next point I want to talk about is that there are a few myths around this idea of this inner critic. And so the first myth I want to debunk here is this myth that our inner critic is always right. One of the biggest traps that we fall into as men is believing that if we feel something, it must be true. But emotions aren't facts. Just because our inner voice is telling us that we're inadequate about something doesn't mean it's a reality. Remember, it's the ego trying to protect us. Because in reality, most successful individuals are going to deal with self-doubt in some way. But when they challenge it rather than acceptance, the difference is that they succeed, and those who don't and really internalize this inner critic, then they end up by having more self-doubt. So it's really about the refusal to allow your inner critic to dictate the actions in your life. And so reframing this myth involves us recognizing that the inner critic is just a perspective. It's only one perspective, doesn't mean it's the right perspective. And it ultimately is not the truth. Instead, if we are blindly believing its messages, we can challenge those messages and we can replace them with evidence-based thinking. Let's face it, there are always lots of opportunities in our lives where we have had success at some level and in some measure. Let's look at myth number 2. You should ignore your negative thoughts. I used to believe this for the longest time. I just won't consider and I'll ignore that negative thought. But many personal development gurus are going to tell you that, hey, man, just do that. And I can remember reading lots of self-help books over the last 30 years or so, thinking to just the power of positive thinking. But when we ignore that inner critic, it doesn't go away. We're stuffing it down. It just makes it louder. So this suppression is going to lead to emotional buildup. That's why at times men will explode, and usually it shows up as anger or rage in different ways. And when we start to recognize that the more that we try to ignore this inner critic, all what we're doing is we're just creating a more stressful environment that at some point it will explode. And so we get not only just stress, but anxiety starts to increase, and even our physical health. It's how our body will start to store all of this pressure. And so if you're struggling with losing weight, could be part of it is how this inner critic is working with you and how your body is storing it. So, a real powerful strategy is to question our inner critic's message. And the question you ask yourself is, where is that? Where is the evidence that this thought that I'm having right now is true? And what would I tell a friend who had this thought? So, when you ask those two questions, you can start to unpack and unravel what the message this inner critic is starting to send us. Let's look at myth number 3. Confidence means we're never feeling self doubt. Now, at first blush, you think that makes sense, but realistically, and as we've talked about earlier, all successful people, no matter what level of success, have and encounter self doubt in their life. So there's this false belief that only true confident men ever experience self doubt. And in reality, even the most successful of them, whether it's an athlete, a CEO, military leaders, deal with their inner criticism regularly. I think about the story of Michael Jordan and all the success that he's had. And he had lots of doubters telling him in his career where he wasn't a great defensive player. And then so he started to put action toward it. I would suggest that the reason why he became a top defensive player was there was a bit of self-doubt. His drive to succeed in part was based on somebody telling him and then him believing that he wasn't good enough. So I'm going to go to work to prove it. And it's interesting to see how this shows up in different ways in our lives. The difference is that we don't let these successful people, they don't allow their actions to be dictated by that inner critic. They recognize that self-doubt is just part of the process. And then when you accept that, then we can move forward. And so really, truthfully, true confidence is not the absence of doubt, but it's that ability to act despite of having it. So learning how to harness and reframe our inner critic is going to be the key to turning self-doubt into a powerful motivator rather than inhibitor. So the next thing I want to talk about is giving us an opportunity to recognize the patterns of our inner critic, because our inner critic will have certain patterns in how they show up in our lives. And one of the ways that it shows up is through self-sabotage. It's when we avoid growth. And that's when our inner critic starts to convince us to say that we're in our comfort zone, so we're going to try to avoid the pain of possible failure. So it keeps us suppressed. It's that negative predictions that start to already pre-forecast the worst case scenario in your mind. And while that might be an all right tool to look at what the worst case scenario is and then determine whether you can handle it or not, and I would suggest that you can handle everything, even if the worst case scenario was death. That's for another episode. But then it starts to amplify that fear. And so then it minimizes the potential reward. So it's focusing on that negative aspect of that potential outcome. Another way that the inner critic shows up, and shows up for me on many occasions, is this idea of being a perfectionist or perfectionism. And so what happens is we set unrealistic goals. So the inner critic says, yes, we're going to do this. And in every podcast episode I put out must hit the level of Joe Rogan. And if I don't achieve that means that I wasn't a success. Let's face it. In every aspect of life, there are going to be those 1%ers. And while that might be a lofty goal and to believe that you can be there, setting goals that are more realistic and attainable, and then growing to the point of being a Joe Rogan makes more sense. And so then there's this fear of being imperfect. I got to tell you, when I started doing podcasting, I really struggled in my first year. I think I put out about 22, 24 episodes. And that was because I struggled every week to come up with a concept or an idea of what I wanted to talk about. And yet, as I sat at the computer with the keyboard sitting blank and a Word document with nothing on it, I found myself with a writer's block. Yet, in the car, driving around, the ideas would flood and go through. There was less pressure. So this idea of being perfect all the time makes it very challenging for us to move forward. And then the next way the inner critic's going to show up is through comparison. Many of us, if not all of us, have compared ourselves to someone at something at some point in time. And have you ever noticed that when you're comparing, how often do you compare yourself and you're a little bit better at something than somebody else? I would say suggest that's probably less the norm, and it's more about the things that you're not doing. Sure, there are maybe little aspects that show up where you think that you're a little bit better than somebody else or another situation. And then having said that, when you start to look at the T square and then the pros and the cons versus it, you start to find more negative things for it. And so this can be a difficult for us, right? So we start to focus on the deficiencies rather than where we're excelling. And so our inner critic likes to do that. It likes to look at all the ways that we're not showing up the way we need to. Social media influence as well. Social media is a necessary evil in today's world, especially if you're in business, but sitting there and measuring yourself versus on the number of likes and shares and your ability to engage with others can be very detrimental to us. And so while we put content out, if you're a content creator, much like myself, I would suggest that having less pressure on what the role does and instead learning to master your craft will be far more productive. And then the last ways as comparison shows up is this idea of zero sum thinking. It convinces us that someone else's success is diminishing who we are. And that's totally not true. If anything, someone else's success in whatever endeavor you're doing should be celebrated because it proves that there is a path forward. Now the decision is, what does your path look like? The next piece I want to talk about is how to identify when our inner critic is truly in action. And so we're going to talk about a bit of self-awareness here and some practices we can do. So one of the things that we can do is just pause and reflect for a moment. The moment you start hearing this inner critic challenging who you are or what it is that you're doing, just notice the self-talk and ask, whose voice is this? And where is it coming from? I think you're going to find that when you ask who's this voice and where it's coming from, that the voice is going to start to sound like somebody that potentially you know, alive or not. And the interesting piece about that is that when you start to recognize it, then you can start to do some other things around how this voice is showing up, changing the tone, changing the pace, changing the tempo. These are different ways to change how this inner critic is showing up on it. But first, you have to recognize, where is this voice, who's this voice, and where is it coming from? The next part is an opportunity is about doing this work is to journal. I'm the first one to say that journaling is one of the things that I struggle with, and I'm not as consistent as I should be. But when I find that when I take a moment, whether that's typing it in a Word document or actually handwriting a note onto this, I find that a lot of the weight and the pressure that is coming from this inner critic starts to disappear, starts to dissipate. It allows me to get into a state or a position where I can gain clarity. Then I can take a step forward. There's lots of common narratives too that I didn't get a chance to talk to Sean that I want to right now, and that the inner critic will have. And one of the things that it will say is that you're not going to be good enough. And I struggled with this for the longest time. And being not good enough really stems from some childhood experiences and our societal pressures. And I'll suggest those are things that we've internalized. And I used to think for years that if you couldn't be first, then there's no use doing it. And how limiting is that in our lives? To walk around and think that if I can't be first, then we won't be doing anything. I think it was Jack Welch talked about that back in the 90s. It was General Electric, about wanting to be first and the top and the best. And from a business perspective, I can understand that. From an individual perspective, I think it's really short-sighted for us to think this way. What if you could be the best that you could be? And then that allows you to propel you forward. The other thing that the narrative that an inner critic could have is, I'll fail, so why bother? And so let's face it, anytime you're going to start something, you're probably going to fail, or what the perception of failure is. Again, thinking about the podcast episodes and doing that, if I measured my success based on how close I am to the number of downloads that Joe Rogan has, then I would suggest I'm probably a failure. However, having close to 200 episodes out and produced also suggests that I have some success in my life. And so it's really about understanding and putting a framework around what does failure look like and what does success look like. The other narrative is I don't deserve the success. And that ties a lot with that first one that I mentioned, which is about not being good enough. And that again comes from how we feel about our self-worth, and it starts to show what the feelings of what may be potential the imposter syndrome. And the imposter syndrome, if you think about it, is really this spectrum where on one end you're totally I'm not good enough and I'm a failure, and the other end of that spectrum is that you're totally self-actualized, you know exactly who you are, and you're very comfortable in your own skin. And somewhere in there we're going to ebb and flow in our terms of how we feel about ourselves. And so understanding how the inner critic will, the language it uses with us, is a good indication of where you're sitting on this spectrum of the imposter syndrome. There's also going to be physical cues. I mentioned that earlier. There'll be some things that are happening in our body. And so we're going to notice when the imposter syndrome or the inner critic is showing up. We can notice that maybe our shoulders start to slump. Our body language isn't strong and powerful with our shoulders back, but instead we're slumped and we're hunched over. We start to avoid eye contact. Eye contact is a very powerful thing. And then we might even feel tightness in our chest. These are all just physical responses. And when you start to understand what's happening in your body, when the inner critic shows up, we can start to develop some ways to change and overcome that. And our energy levels will also potentially shift and change. And so a persistent self-criticism can really drain who we are, can leave us feeling fatigued and completely unmotivated, which is why we don't take that next step. I talked a little bit earlier in the languaging that there will be some tone to it. So not only is who is that voice and where did it come from, but what's the tone of the language? Is it judgmental? Is it using absolute language like always and never? These are indications that this is the inner critic talking. It's your ego, that ego mind that's trying to protect you because it feels that if I don't protect you, then it no longer survives. So that's a pretty heavy, pretty deep comment. Stuff that we're going to touch on in other episodes. Do stick around and listen to them. And there's going to be, again, we talked about this unfair language, right? So you're going to hear your inner critic possibly saying things like, he's much better at this than I'll ever be. And that might be the truth. But what measurement are you using to have that as being a definitive way to measure your success and how you are showing up? And so there's lots of language around that. And it's got some cynical predictions, right? Again, we talked about why even try, how this will end. Listen, maybe it won't end well, depending on your definition. On the other end, it's an opportunity for growth. It's opportunity to learn a little bit more about yourself and who you are as an individual. One of the books that I really appreciated learning from and reading was by Byron Katie, and she introduced the world to this framework that she calls the work. And what it does is it helps individuals challenge their inner critic by questioning negative thoughts. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this episode and how her method has encourages self-compassion, so it can provide you with more clarity and make it a powerful tool for all of us that struggle with self-criticism. And so one quote from her book that I like is, when you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time. And so Byron asks 4 powerful questions. When the self-critic comes up, the first question she asks, is this true? And yes or no. And if no, then she asks you to move to question 3. And question 3 is, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? So those 2 real powerful questions. But let's go back and say, is this true? Yes or no? And if you say yes, then the second question she asks us to, or challenges us to ask, is, can you absolutely know that it is true? Yes or no? Either way, you're ultimately going to get to the third question. How do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? And finally, the last question she asks is, who or what would you be without the thought? This simple yet powerful 4-question framework really helps us to unpack what the inner critic is saying and doing, and gives us that opportunity to truly debunk many of the things that is holding us into a limiting belief about who we are. And so I want to share a story about John about getting into shape. It's a very similar story to what I struggle with and what I work at the most here in my personal journey. So John is in his early 30s, early 40s, should say. He's a husband and he's a father of 2. He's juggling a demanding career and family life. And every morning, as he's ready to tie his tie in front of the mirror, he couldn't help but notice the man staring back at him. Boy, does that ever sound familiar. The man who looked tired, out of shape, and far from the confident athlete that he used to be. He'd think about getting back into shape, but every time he'd considered going to the gym or changing his diet, that inner critic voice would step in. John, you're too busy. It's too late for you, buddy. You'll never stick with it. These words felt like a concrete wall, stopping him from before he could even get started. It was finally one day that the breaking point came, and John was at the park with his kids. And I can remember this a few years ago, trying to play tag. And after a few minutes, he was winded, struggling to catch his breath, and feeling the sting of embarrassment. His youngest son, laughing innocently, said, "Come on, Dad, you're too slow." That night, John sat there alone in his kitchen, and that inner critic started to go into overdrive. You'll never be the dad they deserve. Look at yourself. But for the first time, John pushed back. He asked himself, what if I could prove this voice wrong? What if I could change, not for perfection, but to feel better and be there for my kids? You know, it's a small spark of defiance, but it was enough to get him thinking differently. So John decided, start small. Instead of signing up for an intense gym membership, he began walking 10 minutes every morning before going to work. The inner critic was relentless, though, as he always is. What's the point? This won't make a difference. You know what? John ignored him. And the next week, he had another 5 minutes to a walk. By the third week, he was jogging short intervals. Then came the small changes to meals. Because let's face it, weight challenges deals with 2 things: nutrition and exercise. And so he started to swap sugary snacks. For me, it's salty stuff with, snacks for fruit, adding more vegetables into dinner, changing the composition of his plate. And every small win started to give John just a little boost of confidence. And little by little, he started to change. Not only did he see it in his body, but even more importantly, in his mindset. Because this inner critic didn't disappear, but it got a little quieter. And in its place, a new voice emerged, one of encouragement and pride. So John felt stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. And he started to see himself as a capable transformation. 6 months later, John wasn't running 5Ks. He was running after his kids at the park and going without getting tired. And so his energy levels were up and his confidence restored, and even relationship with his wife had felt even stronger. I'll suggest the confidence that John was now showing sparked all of that change. And so John's transformation wasn't just about the weight that he lost or the miles that he could run now. It was about proving himself that he could silence this inner critic. Each step forward, each small win was another brick in the foundation of the man he wanted to be. So what's the key to John's success? Is that he didn't wait for his inner critic to stop. He acted despite of it. And when doing so, he discovered the truth that confidence isn't about self-doubt. It's about moving forward despite of it. And so let's talk about the framework and some of the things that John did in this story. One of the first things he did is that he reframed his negative thoughts. And so one of the ways that you could do that, and John could do that, was writing down his inner critic's most common phrases. And then just utilize the work framework we just talked about, and ask him, is it true? And what's the evidence? And replace those with more powerful statements. He started to practice self-confidence or self-compassion. And so when we treat ourselves as we would treat a friend, when we make a mistake, we're speaking much more kindly to ourselves. Instead of focusing on what we did wrong or didn't accomplish, we focus on what we can learn in that moment. We start to notice that voice. I've been talking a lot about the actual voice, and people who often listen to their inner critic, without realizing it comes as though at first maybe some background noise. So if we just accept much of its commentary as reality, then we're going to struggle. But when we think about who or what that voice sounds like, then we can recognize the voice may start to sound familiar, might even be somebody from the past, as we talked about earlier. So now we can challenge this voice and reframe the negative into a more empowering I statements, connecting the voice to our actions. And when the voice happens, how is it impacting our decisions? We can start to recognize that voice showing up. We can start to make different decisions. And finally, we start to alter our behavior by taking conscious, proactive action. And the last thing I suggested, John, and for many of us, we just start to limit our comparisons. We focus on our journey. It's the journey that we're on is the most important, not the comparison. And we celebrate our progress versus measuring against what someone else might have done. And so that's a lot of information here I've given you here on this inner critic. And so if you're looking for more information over the ways and where you can find it on this, I suggest going to Byron Katie's book. Her book is called Loving What Is, 4 Questions That Can Change Your Life. Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff, another great book for you to look into, and Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. Each of these are going to offer you with powerful insights to mastering self-doubt, building self-confidence. So what's the key takeaway for you to have today is that just to recognize that our inner thought isn't meant to destroy us. It's meant to be mastered. And so the difference between those who succeed and those who stay stuck isn't the absence of self-doubt, but the decision to act despite of it. And so your challenge today is to pay attention to that inner critic. The next time doubt creeps in, stop, challenge it, reframe the thought, and choose confidence over fear. And so, men, the strongest warriors are not those without fear, but those who fight despite it. And if you're ready to silence self-doubt and take control of your mindset, take action now, I'd like you to visit our membership page, members.theawakenedman.net. And I have a free integrity challenge for you to take. It's a roadmap helping you become a more confident version of yourself. Again, just go to members.theawakenedman.net. And see, the strongest men don't wait. They decide, they lead with confidence, so they get started right now. Well, thank you for joining me on today's episode of the Revolutionary Man podcast. Remember, confidence starts with mastering our inner voice. Take control of it. I'm going to see you next time. Aho.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is the Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.